I would hope not. And the reason for that is because we are dealing here with insurgents who are moving across borders at ease and creating all kinds of insecurity in neighboring countries. And I think that realization hopefully is already there. So one would think that Mozambique would welcome a SADC response to the situation.
But the insurgency itself has been ongoing for an incredibly long time. For people who are trying to place this development, why has it taken so long for SADC to even talk of convening a meeting before intervening in Mozambique itself?
Yes, that's a very important issue. It's been going on since 2017 and it has been escalating ever since. And one would have thought that SADC should have intervened or decided what to do at least a long time ago. Because the longer you leave this to fester, this wound will become worse, and eventually it might sort of have serious consequences for other neighboring countries, and most probably, including, of course, for Mozambique. So this is a rather belated response by SADC, and it is indeed a worrisome development.
Yeah. Take us through the legal considerations that SADC should be mulling over as they try to consider the type of intervention they want to make in Mozambique.
Yeah, I think the first issue of concern is, of course, the tight control in the border areas of the different countries to prevent the insurgents from moving into different areas to escape retaliation. We've seen this in the Sahel, and we've seen this with Boko Haram and with Al-Shabaab as well. They're moving across borders in order to regroup, to re-strategize, and to redetermine what attack will be launched next. So I think from a SADC sub-regional point of view, tightening the borders and having proper control in a collective response is, at this point in time, one of the main concerns.
Tightening the borders to suffocate the insurgency or to ensure the insurgency doesn't spill over to other countries? I can think of various unintended consequences to something like this. How much weight should that be given?
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of allow them to be as mobile as they like to be, then of course it's very difficult to deal with the insurgency.
Yeah.
So that is just one element. Of course, the main issue is on the territory of Mozambique. And the question there is whether Mozambique has the capacity at this point in time to deal effectively with the insurgents in the Palma area, which, as we all know, is a natural resource rich area. And that is the other element. So when I talk about a collective effort, it must come from the territorial state to deal with the insurgency on its territory, and secondly, there must be some collective response by the neighboring countries to prevent them from moving in and out into Mozambique and out into different countries. And I think that will take some careful planning on the part of the SADC countries, with, of course, the consent of Mozambique.
Right. I'm not quite sure what the official status, internationally speaking, is on what's going on in Mozambique, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. The atrocities are clear for everyone to see, and I think there's a consensus around that. But would categorizing what's taking place there as a crime against humanity aid insofar as the interventions that can actually be meted out?
Yes, I think one of the best options that we have at the moment, given the factual circumstances, if we want to classify that, we can certainly make out a case of crimes against humanity. The other problem we are sitting with here is, shall we classify this as an internal armed conflict or not? Now, from the perspective of the territorial state, Mozambique, they wouldn't be, too happy to classify it as that, because then they're giving a certain status to the insurgents. So they will probably deal with it as a terrorist problem to be dealt with within domestic law. And that is one of the gray areas we're sitting with at the moment. So we will see how this is going to escalate. It might escalate into a situation where we can clearly classify it as an internal armed conflict, which then will make the Geneva Conventions applicable. And that is one of the issues I think that will probably be also taken into account when SADC meets to decide what kind of response is appropriate in the circumstances as we find them now.
If we are to go with categorizing this as just a terrorist attack, what does that mean for the type of negotiations that can take place, given, of course, the perceptions that come with negotiating with terrorists, not only in Mozambique, but certainly across the world?
Yeah, I think when we talk about it as a domestic issue in terms of a counter-terrorist response, then of course Mozambique is best placed at this point in time to deal with that. But there are security threats that face the other neighboring countries around Mozambique. And of course they will have to deal with it also within their domestic law. And once again, it's better to have a collective sub-regional response to this issue because of the fact that these terrorists, whatever we want to call them, do not remain in one place. They sort of move around. And that is how they become successful and how they sort of enable themselves to launch attacks. And it might happen not only in one country, but in several. And I think that at this point in time is probably high on the agenda of the SADC countries. And I really hope so, because this is a belated response by SADC.
Yeah, it's one of those instances on the continent where the law and politics are intersecting in ways perhaps we haven't fully comprehended. I wonder whether that will present unneeded hurdles to getting to the point where there's essentially stability on the ground, so to speak. I mean, in many instances, we're told the Mozambican government is concerned around its image in SADC if it were to allow this type of help, really, because it is a mild, if you like, concession that it's incapacitated to deal with the problem.
Yes, of course. It is an issue for Mozambique. If it can't deal with it on its own, then it would have to sort of invite help from elsewhere. And I've already come across some reports alleging that Portugal is sending military advisors to assist with the training of special forces. So that in itself tells us that the problem might be bigger than we established on this side of the border. And it might also be that other kinds of assistance will be provided. And let me just make it clear, this is what normally happens in many of these conflicts on the African continent. If we take the Mali conflict, which started in 2011, 2012, when the Tuareg rebellion started, where Mali was forced because of the inaction of the African Union to invite French forces to rescue it. And what do we have now at this point in time? We have a massive sort of instability in the whole region, crossing the whole Sahel part of Africa. We have the same with Boko Haram, causing turmoil in neighboring countries. And we have the same with Al-Shabaab in East Africa. So that is what should be prevented, to allow this to develop to that point, because then it becomes extremely difficult to dislodge these insurgent groups.
Yeah, and from your reading, why do you think it takes so long for African leaders to even say anything about what's happening in some of their neighboring countries, to the point where, as you mentioned, there needs to be intervention from the global north? It's not necessarily because of a lack of a legal framework to intervene, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. The legal framework is there, and it's a well-developed legal framework, and it's comprehensive, both on the continental level and on the regional or sub-regional level. I think it's a lack of political will, it's a lack of capacity, and I think one of the main issues with these conflicts and the early warning systems are not functioning properly. And that is, I mean, we have the sort of legal framework for these early warning systems, but I think they lack the sort of capacity to effectively provide early warning to governments and so on. And I also think there's a sort of leftover of the old OAU concept of state sovereignty. There's a reluctance to become involved in issues of this kind because of state sovereignty. And I think this is still one of the legacies that African countries are struggling with to overcome at this point in time.
Yeah, there's a line obviously to be drawn, though, about when you can allow the sovereignty of a nation to prevail and when you should intervene because of the clear atrocities being committed there. A sentiment I'm sure you agree with. But if we were to look into the future, what kind of restorative reckoning can a country like Mozambique have? I'm thinking of the type we had with the TRC here in South Africa after apartheid, because there's going to be a need for that to happen, especially when you look at just how much carnage and trauma has been caused to people who'll be alive for many years to come.
Yeah, indeed. So that might be one of the options to deal with this issue post the conflict. The question is, when will the conflict end, and what damage would be done in the meantime, and that will determine what will be the restorative, avenue that Mozambique is going to choose. But I think we are a long way from that, and we will now have to deal with the issue at hand and see that that is contained and effectively dealt with.
Professor Strydom, thanks very much for your insight on this.